So again, welcome everybody. So today is about the Bank Imperial, which is translated as Bank Imperial or Imperial Bank commercials that ran from 1992 to 1998. And these are some of the most beloved, acclaimed commercials in the Russian advertising canon. They've every time there's a big anniversary of the commercials, there are lots of write-ups about it. It's been given awards as the best commercials of the last 20 years. And it's also given the language a couple phrases that are used as kind of memes that everybody knows, even though these commercials have been off the air for so long. There was a spin-off series of commercials for an affiliate bank called I think Slavyansky or Slavyanska, with about poets and poems, but we're not going to do that one today. All right, so these are in many ways the opposite of the MMM commercials, though I'd say between the two of them, between MMM and Bank Imperial, you really have some of the biggest stories in Russian advertising in the 90s. But again, so very different. If MMM was so deliberately lo-fi to the point where you could hear echoes as the characters are talking during the commercials, here the production values are really unparalleled. As the director said, they were making little movies. Now, these are commercials for a bank, and a bank that's long defunct, and it's selling a product that's really hard to discern. The name of the bank and the subject matter suggest that we might be dealing with pro-imperial conservative backlash that would come to dominate Russian culture in the next couple of decades. Of course, Imperial is a kind of buzzword, but it's actually a lot more complicated and less awful than that. These series of commercials do have an ideology and a politics, but it's not exactly what the name would suggest. As we'll see, I would say that what's at work here is something imperial, but it's a kind of imperial humanism or humanist imperialism, or maybe imperialism with a human face, that had a particular type of aesthetic and maybe more than aesthetic appeal. First, I want to give some background about the bank itself and why they commissioned these very expensive commercials. So Bank Imperial was founded in Moscow in 1990, that is before the collapse of the Soviet Union, which makes it one of the earliest commercial banks. It was part of a plan to create Neftegazprom as a vehicle for the monopoly on oil and gas exports, a role that would later be assumed by Gazprom. And it was part of then Soviet Prime Minister Valentin Pavlov's plan, which involved, it's very complicated and I don't even understand all of it, and I don't think we need to for the purposes of today's lecture, but it involves steering hard currency reserves from their original purposes, whatever they happened to be, towards creating and improving the oil export infrastructure. All of this was going to somehow lead to the Soviet ruble becoming a freely convertible hard currency. And Bank Imperial was supposed to be the financial operator behind building new pipelines and improving old pipelines, and therefore ensuring the country's financial future. But obviously, something happens in 1991, and that's the USSR collapses. But the bank remains, and now two of the bank's biggest shareholders are Gazprom and Lukoil. Gazprom and other shareholders eventually lose interest in supporting Imperial's monopoly on the financial flows for the construction, so the bank has to find other things to do, other sources of income. One of the big things it'll do in the 90s is it'll get involved in dealing with the USSR's debts, which we don't need to talk about now, but also it's going to try to get involved in the open market. It was the first Russian bank to issue Visa cards in 1995. And early in the 90s, as today's lecture obviously shows, they decided to have a big ad campaign. And they had this ad campaign, but one has to ask, who is the audience? Did consumers really need that much from their banks? Did they really need banking services? And were the services that they needed in any way commensurate to the scale of the advertising here? And the answer to that last question is absolutely not. So we're going to, as we look at the commercials and get a little closer to them, we'll talk about what might have been at work behind this operation. The 1998 financial crisis nearly killed the bank and really should have killed the bank. In August, it lost its license. It went bankrupt the next year. There were corruption scandals, but in 1999, it got its license back. Lukoil supported it for the next 4 years, but it lost its license again in 2004. That was basically it, although in 2017, a group of investors tried to get a new license for Imperial. So that's the story of the bank. So there were so many banks in the 90s, most of which are not with us anymore, that Bank Imperial would not be remembered for its activities by anyone except people who are studying the history of Russian finance, and that certainly would not be me. But they are going down, ironically, in history for the historically themed advertisements. That is the one thing that this bank really left to the world. And the bank, under the leadership of a man named Rodionov, put together a very capable team to do these commercials. The copywriter Perepelkin, and most important, Timur Bekmambetov, the filmmaker, who at this point had made one or two, I think, noteworthy films, but would go on after this to have a huge career in Russian and Hollywood, first with Night Watch and Day Watch, and then eventually with films like Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Hunter. After seeing a bit of Bekmambetov over the years, I would have to say these commercials really are his best work. But that's just my opinion. He had an unlimited budget to do these commercials, which is ironic, right? Because if you're thinking about a bank and a financial institution, you might not want a financial institution that's just going to throw money around recklessly. That's not necessarily a good calling card, but that's exactly what they did. So the people behind these commercials have been interviewed many times, both in connection with these various anniversaries and just because the interest in these commercials really, really remains. So we have Bekmambetov in particular on record giving us a lot of background information. He said he was approached, he said, to do a TV commercial for a bank. And my response was, "What's that?" And they explained it. I said, why do you advertise a bank? If there's a bank, then people go, then maybe that's really it. And if otherwise they might not show up, or are there really people to actually be interested in the bank services? And the response was, maybe the people will show up. And Bekmambetov explained this as the initiative of what he called smart people, but basically rich people who were behind all these companies, including Imperial, who had gone abroad, seen commercials, and came back with the idea that commercials are something that a self-respecting company should do. And Rodionov, the head of Bank Imperial, who apparently watched a lot of commercials, had one particular criterion for these commercials. He would say, does it make you want to cry or not? If it makes you want to cry, it's a good commercial. I'm not sure these commercials make you want to cry, but they do move you, perhaps. Now, Bekmambetov does give them credit for understanding the nature of a brand, which was still a very new but very trendy concept at the time, that building a brand isn't necessarily about talking about the quality of the product, but about making an emotional connection with the brand, between the consumers and the brand. And that certainly worked for this particular ad campaign, even though it couldn't possibly translate into revenue. So when this all starts, Vladimir Perepelkin, the copywriter, goes to Bekmambetov and says, okay, I have an idea for like 3 commercials, and they're all going to be around this one phrase, this very famous French phrase, l'exactitude et la politesse des rois, which is translated into English usually as punctuality is the politeness of kings. Now in Russian, it becomes Torchness, вежливость королей, which is a very good translation. However, one important thing happens. That is different from the English translation and perhaps closer to the French, which is that Torchness means precision. Torchness isn't just about time. So if you translate this as punctuality, some of these commercials don't make sense. But what the first 3 or 4 commercials are really focusing on is this idea of precision that is conveyed through these historical plots that I guess somehow give you a sense that you're in the hands of a bank that does things properly, but even that's a bit of a stretch. So what's going to happen now is we're going to just go through a bunch of these commercials. First, we're going to start out with the Torchness commercials, and along the way, we'll talk about what's going on in them. So, so we're going to be watching these on my website, eliotborenstein.net, on the Russian commercial section, which has so some of these videos have English translations as subtitles. Some of them, as in last time, I put below the video and as files to download. Sasha, if you could find the exact link to that page and put it in in the chat, that would be really great. Okay, but the first commercial has almost no words. That's quite helpful here. So let me share the screen.
С точностью до секунды. Точность, вежливость королей.
So what is that selling? Hard to say. What's interesting, though, in terms of, as you can see, if you read Russian, of this particular video online, all 20-some videos are online. There are two versions of this commercial. This is the long version, which the person who uploaded helpfully called Pederasti Senatia, basically, excuse me, faggots in the Senate, the scene with the two men who are sort of fawning all over each other. In another version, it doesn't have that. So there's some interesting stuff going on with masculinity here, of course, that there's this, handsome naked bust that falls onto Caesar's, on the back of Caesar's robe while these two guys are making eyes at each other, and then his ass is exposed, and he does the thing that, leaders are supposed to do when they're embarrassed. He covers his ass. He's given advice about it. It has nothing to do, of course, with banks. What this does set up from the very beginning, I think, if this is not the first, it's one of the first commercials here, is this pomp of the Imperial, right? But a very, very human side to it, right? On the one hand, Caesar is Caesar, and he ends up in a position where he's being admired and respected. On the other hand, one of the ways in which we could possibly identify with him, or something that brings him down a bit, is this very human foible of getting his robe caught on something and then being exposed. And that is the dynamic that's going to happen again and again in these commercials. It's a very delicate balance between setting up someone as being larger than life for admiration, and then making them kind of like plain folks. Not exactly like plain folks, still perhaps an example of an exemplary person, but someone who is not necessarily as distant from us as you might think. I mean, this is sort of classic in terms of bringing someone down to your level. If you think of Bakhtin's work on Rabelais and his world, focusing on what Bakhtin so delicately calls the lower bodily stratum, is a way of taking someone down a peg. All right. So there are a couple about Napoleon. And this one is Napoleon and a cannonball. I said bomb, but I really should have said cannonball. All right. So let's go.
Точностью до миллиметра. Точность, вежливость королей.
So again, it's a delicate balance between making him kind of funny with the hat falling off, but then showing him doing this boss move, basically, of stopping the bomb from going off at the very, very last second. So we can laugh at him a bit, but he's worthy of some sort of admiration here. There are two more of these type of commercials. I'm just going to show the last one, which is a particularly surprising move here, which is basically takes all of the characters from the previous commercials, adds a few more in, and sets them up kind of as if we're having a contest as to which of these people has the most Torchness. So here we go. Most precision, I suppose.
С точностью до миллиметра. С точностью до секунды. С точностью до копейки. С точностью до короля.
О, с точностью до короля. Точность, вежливость королей.
So this one gets even more meta than the others. And also looking backwards from the 21st century, if we see that there were 3 different commercials about various kings and their Torchness, and then this one, it's almost like we've been watching the Marvel universe being put together. You know, we have the Hulk, we have Captain America, and then finally we have the Avengers movie where they're all here. And the challenge of that is, of course, having all of these great larger than life figures together without reducing them. And here that's accomplished in part by having this comedic figure of the knight taking most of the comic heat, as well as the guy who's announcing the awards who gets lost in his own notes. And I think just sort of extemporizes that when he can't come up with what the next thing is, to say, precision down to the king, which makes no sense, but they're all kings, and so they can all feel like they're being included in this, which for something that whose main theme seems to be imperial aristocracy is again ironic, because it's a way of making a whole group of people feel like they're individually very special, which might actually be related to the balance that this set of commercials is trying to achieve. So again, only these first few were these Torchness commercials, and Bekmambetov talks about when he has a conversation with Rodionov, the head of Bank Imperial, who it turns out, at least according to Bekmambetov, Rodionov really was most interested in being kind of like a sponsor to the whole idea of really good commercials in Russia. And so Bekmambetov says, I asked him, so why don't you just make films? And Rodionov responds, who's going to watch them? And in the 1990s, that's a big question, right? Not only was the film industry tanking, but so were movie theaters. Making a cinematic release in Russia in the 1990s was by no means a way of ensuring that people were going to see something. So there's television, but the production, most of the stuff that was being produced for Russian television at the time was really crappy in terms of quality, especially in terms of production values. So there was space here, there's cultural space, there's media space for trying to do something really aesthetically interesting through one of the few vehicles that would actually get to just about everybody, and that is, of course, television. After talking to Rodionov, Bekmambetov expands the concept, and thus the theme of the rest of the series, History of the World, Всемирная история Банк Imperial, is born. And that's what all of the other commercials are going to be tagged, Всемирная история. And so then for the next 5 years, they're coming up with these little historical subjects. Kirill Zubkov, a historian, is one of the consultants. They start getting a whole bunch of other consultants. They get suggestions in the mail eventually, and start doing these historically themed stories that are not just about Torchness. And the first one I want to show you is the one that gives probably the most famous phrase to come out of here. So some of these, fortunately, are subtitled in English on YouTube. This is a set of 3 subtitled by Bradley Gorski. I'm very grateful to him. I'm only going to show at this point one of them, the one in the middle, which is about Count Suvorov and Catherine the Great. So.
Что это у нас граф Суворов ничего не ест, а?
Так ведь пост, матушка, до первой звезды нельзя. Ждем-с.
Звезду Суворову Александру Васильевичу.
Екатерина Великая. Всемирная история. Банк Imperial.
Again, nothing presumably to do with the bank, but look at how beautifully this thing is made. The costumes, the sets, but also the acting is of such a high quality compared to everything we've seen so far. The look on Catherine's face when she is confronted with what Suvorov says, and Suvorov's whole bearing. This is like watching an actual film. And again, it's a moment where, on the one hand, where we can see this beautiful festive scene, and we can perhaps project ourselves into this wonderful, noble moment of having this great food and all of that. But this is also Catherine getting a bit of her comeuppance, and also a bit of wordplay, of course, that you can't eat before the first star. And for that, Catherine, after sort of swallowing her discontent, because she can't swallow her food, gives Suvorov a star of honor, and then finally they can eat. And that phrase, why isn't Suvorov eating anything, becomes a phrase you'd hear again and again in the 90s. Also, ждём, we wait, but with that little s at the end, that is an archaic sign of, I guess, sort of respect. I even found only one meme about this, but there are memes. And there are parodies. By the way, there are parodies of all of these commercials. In the 1990s on Gorodok and other shows, people were making a whole set of parodies of these commercials. The parodies, frankly, are not that great, but the fact that they bother, I think, is noteworthy. All right. Okay, now here's one that was only shown a few times, and I think we're going to see why. This is Ivan the Terrible. And again, this one is not subtitled, but the text, you can find the text under it on my site and also in this in the pages I have for download. Okay.
Тьма над нами.
Бояре расхитили казну земли русской!
Бояре казну
Воеводы
расхитили!
не хотят быть защитниками христиан!
Воеводы
Отдали
не
Русь
хотят
на
быть
растерзание
защитниками!
Литве! Ханам! Немцам! Каждый думает о своем богатстве, забыв об Отечестве! А посему, повинуясь великой жалости сердца, беру снова государства свои и буду владеть ими самодержавно.
А на каких условиях?
На каких условиях? После узнаете.
После узнаете!
Иван Грозный. Всемирная история. Банк Imperial.
Yeah, so that's a commercial that ends up with one of the participants murdered by Ivan the Terrible. So not necessarily what you'd expect to see. It was also being aired during the election campaign, the presidential election campaign. So this was quite a daring move here. We have the scene of a czar declaring that he's going to rule as an autocrat, and a lot of interesting things going on. For one thing, the camera starts out below and moving up as, again, this beautiful cinematic thing doesn't have to be there. And we see him shouting to the crowd. And then there's the guy who's repeating what he's saying. This is what counts as media at the time, right? You don't have commercials, you don't have newspapers, you have the guy who's just repeating what is being said. You know, if you think of media and as something in between, as a kind of well, I can't remember the term, go-between, that is literally what is happening with this guy. And at some point, then there's the question of the control of the message. And the guy who says, so what are the terms for autocracy? Again, I love the acting here. He says what terms, and then he's sort of bouncing, so yeah, what are the terms? Looking around, looking to see, are people supporting him in this? And maybe it's dawning on him that this is not going to go well. So this one seems to be a real counterpoint to the general theme of all the other ones of a kind of responsible aristocracy that is both noble and a little bit down to earth and in touch with people. This is a kind of being in touch with people that you don't want to be anywhere near. All right. Okay, then we go back to more feel-good imperial commercials. Here, this is Tamerlane.
Империя Тамерлан, XIV век. Отправляясь в поход, приказал Тамерлан каждому воину оставить у дороги камень. И вырос курган. И был огонь, и была победа. И возвращались они, и поднимали камни свои. Но остались камни. И последним шел Тамерлан. И поднимал он тяжелые камни и говорил с ними, вспоминая их имена.
Тамерлан. Всемирная история. Банк. Imperial.
So this one certainly gets the responsible aristocracy front and center, to the point that he has to feel every single one of the losses. And the way he does this through the stones is really interesting because, of course, it gets a one-to-one correspondence for the men. It's set up, but accumulating that pile and then having them left over has a kind of parallel to banking, to a more mercantilist approach, maybe to accumulation of wealth, and the whole problem of fungibility, right? I mean, one of the most frightening things about a market economy, or even a market economy, is that everything can turn into everything else. No individual dollar, no individual person necessarily means that much. But here, through the use of the stones as symbolism and their accumulation and their remains, we have a leader who is actually pushing against the notion that his own men are fungible, which is a very nice message to have at a time of wild capitalism, even if it is coming from a corrupt bank. All right, and then another very seemingly anti-wealth accumulation message with a commercial about the Incas.
Когда-то давно в Америке жили инки. Они не знали денег, а из золота делали только то, что им нравилось. Бабочек, лягушек, улиток. И когда приплыли испанцы, они вышли навстречу и радовались. И великий инка подарил чужеземцам своих бабочек, лягушек, улиток. А испанцы переплавили их в кирпичи. В день своей казни великий инка простил испанцев. Ведь они родились там, где нет ничего прекраснее золотого кирпича.
Великий Инка. Всемирная история. Банк. Imperial.
So here, that question of fungibility is front and center, right? That the Incas value the artistic things they make from the gold, whereas the Spaniards just have to reduce it to its basic quantity and make it as fungible as possible, in which case they lose any sight of the aesthetics of the gift that is being given to them. Again, a strange message from a bank, which is of course all about fungibility. Also interesting is the use of the Incas here. I can't help but feel a parallel between this and say the 1970s American commercials using Native Americans to make white people feel bad about polluting the land, you know, the Indian chief with a single tear going down his eyes. So there's an Orientalism here using a kind of idea of a sort of primitive noble savagery that is in some ways better than ours, than our life, as a contrast, but giving a message again that seems to be the antithesis of banking. Okay, and again, Alexander the Great. This is another thing about the hoarding and accumulation of wealth. And this commercial, pay attention to color here. There's almost no color except for Alexander's robe, I guess, and another item we're going to see.
IV век до Рождества Христова. Александр Македонский покорил Парфянское царство, но войско его, погрязшее в распутстве, отягощенное богатой добычей, не могло двигаться дальше. И тогда приказал он собрать все трофеи и сжечь. Пошли они дальше, и покорились им и Персия, и Бактрия, и Индия. Александр Македонский. Всемирная история. Банк. Imperial.
So again, looting, hoarding, this is, if you hold on to things too much, it'll slow you down. That soldier may be about to lose his life, but it's so funny that the ring won't get off his finger that everybody just laughs. So again, not much of a banking message. And this commercial reminds me, since this is one that I actually remember seeing on TV in the 1990s, well, a big irony of all this, like, there's such beautiful production values here. And I remember watching it on television in the 1990s, it was beautiful, but the quality of my television screen was so crappy that I couldn't possibly appreciate how well done this was until I saw it on YouTube here on my computer screen. Okay, Genghis Khan. We're almost done here, I promise.
Однажды отец спросил своих сыновей, в чем самое большое наслаждение для человека? Охотиться с беркутом, ответил старший. Быть богатым, ответил средний. И только самый младший из них, Угидей, сказал то, что так хотел услышать отец. Заботиться об Отечестве. Вот самое большое наслаждение для человека. И не солгал Угидей, будущий правитель Монголии, потому что именно так жил великий отец его, Чингисхан.
Genghis Khan. Всемирная история. Банк. Imperial.
Okay, so first of all, the version of the story that the quote you've probably most likely heard of Genghis Khan saying about what it is that is most valuable in life is about killing his enemies and hearing the lamentation of his women. So this is a bit of a different one, but also now it's less about. So it's also not about riches, but it's once again in a way that kind of echoes what's going on with the Ivan the Terrible thing. Here it's about serving your country, in this case, Отечество, which is your fatherland, which, you know, I don't know enough to be sure, but strikes me as a really anachronistic or unlikely type of word for Genghis Khan to be using, since it is so territory-based. I could be wrong about that. And it also suggests something interesting that's going on here. Notice how few of these commercials are actually about Russian history. There are a few more that I'm not showing, but overall they're all world history. It is empire and perhaps somewhat enlightened leadership that brings all these together, so that it's less important to inculcate a kind of pride in Russia than it is to give a sense of a sympathy for a particular type of enlightened rule that you could find anywhere possibly in the world if you have an aristocratic enough soul. Okay, Napoleon again. Here Napoleon in defeat.
17 ноября 1812 года у реки Березины французские войска были окончательно разбиты. Император Наполеон бросил остатки своей армии и бежал в Париж. Тайно. Вы что-то хотели, мадам? Я только хотела полюбоваться на моего императора. Посмотрите, мадам. Это для вас. Здесь я выгляжу гораздо лучше.
Наполеон Бонапарт. Всемирная история. Банк Imperial.
So that's the last one I want to show you. And this one does a lot of work here. So Napoleon is in retreat, and he's not at his best. Not just because he's lost, but because he's running away in secret. He's discovered by this old woman who just wants to admire the emperor. And this is a moment when he seems least worthy of admiration. So he gives her a coin, gives her money, which is a nice thing to do. The coin has his face on it, though, and he says, actually, I look a lot better here. So this has a lot going on. Part of it has to do with the question of fungibility, right? I mean, what could be more original than the actual Napoleon himself? But by this point, the actual Napoleon might not be worth as much as a Napoleon as a coin. And Napoleon is now dead, of course, but presumably the coins were around for quite a long time. And that this could turn around the whole question here of fungibility and money here, in that in this particular case, Napoleon is leaving something better of himself behind in the form of a coin than in the form of his own body. And of course, it's quite ironic that he looks better on the coin. And of course, he's going to look better on the coin. They're not going to take a bad picture of him and put it on there. So we now end up with a way in which, the money ultimately could be of more value than the person whose face is put on it, than the person who's behind it. And now maybe there's a kind of aristocracy that can be fungible. Maybe this is really pushing in the right economic system and in the right attitude. But all of this, again, it's a very strange approach to advertising banking, to advertising capitalism. And so when Biethev's asked about this and asked about the strategy behind all this, he says, well, there's no strategy here. We just needed to show some stories to have some catharsis. The clips had to be about aristocracy. These had to be special people with who had the kind of greatness of spirit. But really, these commercials were made for 5 people: Prime Minister Chernomyrdin, and a few other people, the people in the companies. The whole idea was to create the impression that the person here is not a crook, not a cynic. That is to actually hold up the example of someone in power, someone possibly with wealth, as a decent person. And I cannot stress enough how unlikely a project this was in the 1990s. I think we talked about this, I've talked about this in so many other contexts. The idea of having someone who's rich and powerful be someone who's also decent is almost unthinkable in the 1990s for a variety of, I think, rather obvious reasons. So the ad campaign here is less about the bank than about the kind of people who might own a bank. It's, in a way, PR for the idea of a new aristocracy of people who have power and who have money and deserve it. They're not just crooks. It's a nice idea. It's not going to take root very well, but they're selling a vision. And so once again, one of the themes that we've talked about again and again in a series of lectures is the question of advertising something that you can't really buy. What are you selling here? Back to the Soviet commercials when there were things that weren't ever available or rarely available, to MMM when they're just selling a scam. Here, once again, there's nothing concrete, but the important thing here is to sell an idea, which really means we're getting back to the notion of pure PR or propaganda, right? That it's less about getting people to buy things than to feel or think a certain way. It wants you to connect to aristocracy, to empire and greatness, but with human flaws that can make you actually imagine these people as real people and not as just some sort of abstract ideas. And if MMM was about identifying the lowest, simplest version of a person you could identify with, this makes it possible to identify aspirationally, and maybe, just maybe, to imagine an empire with a human face. All right, that's all I wanted to say. I am happy to take questions or comments.
Yes, yeah, thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you, Eliot. It was, kind of nostalgic to look at all those videos, which of course we watched almost religiously on TV in the 1990s. And and at that time, we know very little about what banking is. What bank was more of a, metaphor of some money transactions. And I think those videos did not have any point of actually saying anything about bank practices as such, except for точности, там, the минуты, the секунды, etc. But probably it was just a stamp of the bank's presence in people's psyche, in the public sphere, etc. Well, at least people remembered. And at the same time, as I watch it now, I think that, well, that bank in the 1990s must have had an enormous amount of money, because staging all that, you really need resources. Yeah. And at the same time, it's some kind of evidence of this good education that Soviet people, former Soviet people, still had from the Soviet education system. People were exposed to world history at school, and that's why all those things, Alexander the Great and Genghis Khan and everyone else, somehow it was a part of what people knew about. Yes, so, well, so my comment rather is that, well, it's a cultural evidence of these things.
Absolutely, I agree, and I think it can serve as a kind of nice transition in this moment of transition, right? That at a time when the general feeling is mass culture, and especially commercials, are crap, and they're beneath the dignity of an educated person. Even if you can kind of enjoy the MMM commercials, really, they're just so crass. Here, there's the possibility that this new mass culture can produce something that you can really enjoy and not feel degraded by watching. At the same time that it's also doing the work, I think, of, yes, it's not really about banking. I mean, I'm trying really hard to make it about banking just because I feel like I should, because it's a bank, but less about banking than the system and the network of connections that makes banking possible, and that is, capitalism. One of the messages here can be, don't hate the rich people. They're not so bad. Don't hate the people in power. They're not so bad either. This is basically how I learned to stop worrying and love capitalism in its way. I don't think it's that necessarily pointed, but it's one of the few visions of a capitalist world with high finance behind it that actually feels kind of human and not crass and horrible. And it all turned out so well.
So we have a question from Olya Prokopenko. Assuming that the Bank and Imperial commercials were approved by the bank owners, how much of their own commentary on the current affairs could a commercial contain?
Good question. Like, for instance, the Ivan the Terrible one seems to be the one that's most pointed in terms of a commentary on current affairs. Obviously, that one got through, but wasn't shown very much. I don't know. I mean, I think as long as they were functioning in this realm of kind of the allegorical or the elusive with an A, they were able to get away with things. But I think one of the things that made them successful and appealing is that, to the extent that there was political content, it wasn't obvious, it wasn't in your face, so that even if one can see it as a kind of propaganda, it's subtle enough propaganda, again, to make you feel like you're not experiencing something particularly awful. So it could be propaganda for a system, but not propaganda for a person, not propaganda, even barely propaganda for an individual bank, right? So I think the general approach here was to stay so far away from anything current that the viewer could make a connection if they wanted to, but it wasn't really required. So I just don't have evidence of commercials that came out that, besides this one, that would have come into any sort of trouble. And I haven't seen any discussion from Bikmabietov and others about censorship or anything like that. I could have missed it, but I haven't seen it.
And then we have another question from Olya. Did MMM, Bank Imperial, and Slaviansky Bank come out at the same time?
So there was overlap, right? So because MMM was particularly big for 1994, Bank Imperial is from 1992 to 1998. So definitely at the same time there. There was a third one. I'm sorry, I forgot what the other one was. Or was that it?
Slaviansky Bank.
Oh, Slaviansky is towards the end of Imperial and after, because Slaviansky survives Imperial's crash initially. So it's I don't know how much overlap there was, and more, I think it was more of a replacement.
Okay. We have a comment from Peter Rutland. The Genghis Khan clips reminded me a lot of Sergei Bodrov's 2008 film Mongol, made for the Kazakh government. It seems like he was tapping into a long-standing, powerful undercurrent of Asiatic despotic leader images.
He was, but when it comes to Asiatic despotic leader images, this is a nice one, right? I mean, this is one of the nicest Genghis Khans I've ever seen. It's not about violence. It's about a kind of responsibility that isn't to the extent, and I'm not well versed in Genghis Khan and popular culture, but isn't the first thing that comes to my mind when I think of representations of Genghis Khan. So I think it's all of this stuff is using sort of Orientalist imagery and all that, but in this case, without having necessarily a sort of noble savage thing about it at all, unlike the Inca thing, I think is going against the despotic leader notion rather than supporting it.
And here we go. From Oksana Sterenko, are there any sociological studies about the effect of these commercials on the audience?
Probably. I didn't see any. And I'm not sure if I would call them sociological. I mean, sociology wasn't in the greatest of shape at this particular point. I don't know if there were focus groups, for instance. I don't know. I would think if there were any set of commercials that people were being asked about, it would be this one. But unlike, say, other companies that you could imagine doing focus groups or doing some sort of market research because they're actually interested in the result of the commercials, there's not a particularly concrete result for these commercials to have. So the research really would have had to be by scholars. And again, I've looked around. I haven't, since this isn't something I'm doing for publication, I haven't looked around as responsibly as I would for an article, but I haven't seen anything like that. Okay, then. So next week for our final installment, it's about feminine hygiene products being advertised in Russia. This was quite a taboo that was being broken here. In a sense, like Snickers, and Putin famously put Snickers and Tampax together in a single sentence. It's the antithesis of so much of what we're talking about here. These are very concrete products that have a very important role in people's lives. The attempt to bring them to the airwaves has all sorts of fascinating implications. So I hope to see some of you next week. Thank you all.